Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Politics of war. The President of the United States, the evening before the 13th commemoration of the attack on the United States, 9/11/2001, 9/11/2014, goes to the American people from the White House to announce a war on the Takfiri jihadists of the Islamic State, men who claim not to be Al-Qaeda, but as Ryan Crocker said, quite ironically in the Wall Street Journal last week, this is Al-Qaeda 6.0. These men are in ideological dispute with Al-Qaeda, but do not be fooled. Al-Qaeda of al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda of the Maghreb, Al-Qaeda of Afghan Pakistan are also Takfiri jihadists who mean you dead unless you obey them, who mean you a slave unless you follow their version of Islam. They're ideologues. They're gangsters. Do not play the game of good al-Nusra, bad Islamic State. These are gangsters. They have addresses. They will be sought out and brought to ground. However, it's going to take time, and the president presented that to the American people. A lot of politics these last days, and my professionals are here to comment because with 50 days, less than 50 days to go till the election, the major Senate races can or cannot react to this in time. The war fighting, the national security, the threat, the beheading of Foley and Sotloff are not part of the polling yet, but they will be, and certainly national security and fear has always been part of the polling. This does not look to favor the party in power unless it delivers, or does it? Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, is my colleague and co-host, and I begin with David Drucker of the Washington Examiner. Mr. Drucker, a very good evening to you. All of a sudden, national security goes to the top of the list, and income inequality, the minimum wage, other domestic matters that have been featured by the Democrats are no longer the major issue for the American people. It looks like the logic of this, David, would change the Senate races, but does it? Does this favor Republicans or Democrats? Does this favor incumbents or empty seats? Good evening to you, David.
And I think at the end of the day, we're going to be right back where we started, right around the president's speech right before it. And the reason I think that is in part because the president didn't rally the nation to war. He told them that he was taking them to war, but he, in a sense, rallied them to a counterterrorism effort, the kind of which we've been doing all along. And that is not the kind of thing that really upends the playing field, not in the incumbent party's direction. And on the other hand, while polling has shown that Americans generally like the idea that the president is doing something about ISIS because this is a real huge concern, and we've seen it all in the polling, they don't necessarily have a lot of confidence that the president's plan is going to work. And so, I think you'll see Congress act on this week, and I think you'll see this election pretty much go right back where it was a week or so ago, obviously with the caveat that whenever we're at war, events can happen, positive and negative, to alter the political calculus.
Mr. Funn, does the president commit his party to risk here by announcing this war fighting so close to the election?
Oh, absolutely. The president is risking a lot 6 weeks before the election. Remember, he was in peril 6 weeks before the 2012 election after Benghazi. He got out of that with some beginning-like moves.
John, I'm going to have to stop you because we'll have to reconnect to you. Thaddeus, I'll come to you with the same question. You've been through election cycles. You've been through election cycles in war fighting during the Bush administration. This close to the election, to announce a new offensive, is this at risk for the incumbent party, which in the Senate case is the Democrats?
Look, I think the risk is not to do his job as commander-in-chief to protect the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic. I think that what Mr. Drucker and Mr. Fund are trying to point out is that the president did not do a convincing job of assuring the American people that that is the policy of the United States government and it will continue. Now, as for the Republicans, I've noticed that just as they did in the case of Egypt when that revolution occurred, they're just simply going along with the president. They're not really pointing out any differences necessarily that they would have in terms of the continued counterterrorism operation in which we are really engaged. So I think Mr. Drucker's right. It'll probably, by the absence of the president's strong response response to rally the nation to this clear and present danger, and the failure of the Republican Party to put forward a clear and convincing plan, either in support or in contradiction to the president's plan, the public's just going to look at him and go, well, if it works, it'll work, and we'll see if it does.
There was another political risk over the weekend, and that was Mrs. Clinton in Indianola, Iowa, at the State Fair for Senator Harkin. I correct myself earlier. I said Iowa State Fair. That's the Kansas State Fair I was thinking of. But in any event, David, I come to you on this. Mrs. Clinton in the field talking about issues that are favorable to a Democratic candidacy in 2016, such as income inequality, such as minimum wage. Does this war fighting change the trajectory of her plans or her prospects for 2016 now that she's out of office?
Well, let's see where we are a year from now, and if she's a candidate a year from now. What I do think is that if every circumstance that we're dealing with today holds a year from now, it could be quite a different election for her than a lot of people thought. Doesn't mean she doesn't win the Democratic nomination. She's probably the only real major candidate that runs. But I think that she's going to have to answer for her role as Secretary of State and theoretically one of the key architects of an Obama foreign policy that doesn't look as good today as it did a couple of years ago in the eyes of many Americans.
Mr. Fund, I believe we have you back. You can answer either. Does this put the Democrats at risk in less than 50 days? Does this, in some fashion, change the way Mrs. Clinton must present herself for 2016 as a foreign policy question mark?
Mrs. Clinton will say as little as possible about foreign policy for as long as possible because she doesn't want to get dragged into the morass of questions that David indicated. As for the midterm elections, foreign policy has been the latest factor that has driven the president's approval rating down below 40% in state after state where Democratic senators are up or they're defending Senate seats. Chaos and confusion abroad always lead to dissatisfaction and poor voter turnout among base voters of an incumbent party. So this only adds to the Democratic problems.
Thaddeus, your measure of Mrs. Clinton's teasing the Democratic activists in Iowa at the steak fry. Is she at this point ready to reconsider her candidacy on the basis of foreign policy, or can she just hope the way we did in the 60s that the Vietnam War will go away by the time we get out of college?
Well, no, I think that she's put a lot of time and effort, obviously, into establishing her own political policy maker bona fides, especially serving as Secretary of State. So this Benghazi situation becomes, and this ISIS situation becomes for her, either affirmations of her ability to lead the nation through troubled times, or they become huge obstacles to her even getting the chance because of a failed performance in this past post. So I think that that's really where it's at with her. Now, I think that she will continue to go forward. That has always been the Clintons' modus operandi when confronted with a political challenge, is to try to go through it before they tunnel under it or try to go around it. So I think that in Iowa she's not teasing anybody. I think this is something she's doing. It's another prudent prerequisite to achieving her party's nomination.
I want to go around one more time, gentlemen. We'll be quick here. David, the Democratic Party's strength is its anti-war progressive faction. That's not Mrs. Clinton. She's a hawkish candidate in comparison to other choices, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And that would suggest that it's not going to be an easy fit for the Democratic Party come 16.
No, it's going to be all about her ability to win the general election, because after Obama, you're going to see you're going to see a split in the Democratic Party. You're going to see some angst, the way you've seen on the Republican side, where the progressives are going to want a more liberal tack.
Mr. Fund, that would look to have created a problem for the Clintons that they cannot solve easily. Mrs. Clinton's a centrist or a moderate or a hawk compared to other choices in the Democratic Party. Does that suggest that she can rally the way Mr. Obama did in 08 and 12? And would she be going to the general election in November of 16 with a disinterested party?
The big advantage she has in 2016 over 2008 is she will not have one major well-known opponent. She's basically scared people like Elizabeth Warren out of the race. She'll have various irritants, whether it's Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, Howard Dean, the former Democratic National Committee chairman. She can hope that they divide up the dissatisfaction with her. One runs against her primarily on inequality grounds. One runs against her as the candidate of Goldman Sachs. One runs against her as the war candidate. As long as she can divide her opponents, she will get the nomination.
Thaddeus, finally, the Republican Party. I understand they have their difficulties, but running against a hawkish Mrs. Clinton, is that an opportunity for the party or not?
An opportunity to do what? Lose? I think they'll seize that opportunity.
They know how to lose against Mrs. Clinton, but is there an opening there if she's perceived as hawkish by the Democrats? Can that be finessed in some fashion to your intuition?
The key distinction with 2008 was that if she had been accused of supporting a Republican president's failed war policy, namely to go into Iraq.
Right.
So that's the problem at that point in time that now President Obama was able to exploit with the use of the progressive left and others, and the funding of people like Soros. What you're going to see now is, however, this is a progressive, quote-unquote, president's war fighting policy, and she's going to inherit that, and to me, there's not going to be a Democrat from the progressive left that's going to be able to say, I'm sorry, you're supporting our progressive president's policies. We can't vote for you.
Thaddeus McCotter of WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, John Fund of the National Review Online, David Drucker of the Washington Examiner. When we come back, we'll look at specific Senate races with less than 50 days to go. Especially, I'm looking at Iowa, where Mrs. Clinton was over the weekend, and a 50-50 race. At Colorado, where there's a very bright and aggressive Republican challenger to the sitting senator, and also New Hampshire, Scott Brown versus the popular Shaheen. I'm John Batchelor.